All right, let's set the scene. It's 1914, and you're deep, deep in the heart of the Amazon basin. A small group of men are fighting their way down a river that isn't on any map. Their leader, a man who once commanded one of the most powerful nations on Earth, is fading, fast. He's being consumed by fever, by the jungle itself. This isn't just some grand exploration anymore. No, this has become a desperate, clawing fight for survival, thousands of miles from any chance of rescue.
And that man, well, that was Theodore Roosevelt. You know him. The bull moose, the rough rider, the 26th president of the United States. This guy was a force of nature in his own right. He'd faced down corporate giants, brokered peace between warring nations. He'd bent the world to his will. But here's the thing about the jungle. It doesn't care who you are. Out here, on this uncharted river, all those past achievements meant absolutely nothing. The Amazon was a completely different kind of enemy, ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to human life.
So it just begs this incredible question, right? How on earth did one of the most famous men in the world end up so far from civilization, so completely broken, that he was actually pleading with his own son to just leave him behind to die? To get that answer, we've got to rewind. We have to go back to the beginning of a journey that started with scientific ambition and spiraled into an absolute nightmare.
You see, this whole thing was never supposed to be some epic tale of survival. It all started out pretty modestly, actually. After Roosevelt lost the 1912 election, he was restless. He was looking for what he called the romance of my youth. So he cooked up a plan for a zoological collecting trip for the American Museum of Natural History. Sounds straightforward enough, right? A tough trip for sure, but the mission was just to gather some specimens of South American wildlife.
But then the Brazilian government came back with a counter-proposal, and it was delivered by a man who was just as legendary as Roosevelt, Colonel Cândido Rondon. Rondon was this national hero, the guy mapping Brazil's own vast interior, and he saw a huge opportunity. He basically said, instead of just collecting animals, why not go for true geographic immortality? Why not chart a major, completely unknown river that flows north into the Amazon? It was a total blank spot on their maps. They only knew it by one name, the Rio de Dúvida, the River of Doubt. Now, for a guy like Theodore Roosevelt, a challenge like that, it was absolutely irresistible.
And the crew they put together for this, well, they weren't a bunch of academics. You had Roosevelt and the master explorer Rondon, of course. Then there was Roosevelt's son, Kermit, who was this tough engineer. The expedition's bird expert, George Cherry, was a seasoned naturalist who, and you gotta love this, also had a past that included running guns and fighting in revolutions. So these were hardened men. They were joined by 16 Brazilian paddlers, the camaradas, who really knew the waterways. They all thought they were ready for a difficult but, manageable adventure. They had no idea.
From the moment their canoes touched that water, the River of Doubt started to earn its ominous name. The journey just evolved almost immediately. It went from a scientific expedition to a relentless, brutal series of disasters that would push every single man to his absolute breaking point, physically and mentally.
February 27th, 1914. That was the day. The point of no return. 7 enormous, heavy dugout canoes, some weighing over a ton, packed with enough food for what they hoped would be a 50-day trip. 50 days. Think about that. As they pushed off into that dark, flowing water, they were literally paddling off the edge of the known world. No maps, no idea what was downstream, how long the river really was, or what was waiting for them in the shadows.
And the dangers? Man, they were everywhere. The water itself was alive with piranhas. Roosevelt wrote about the razor-edged teeth, how they could just devour an animal alive in minutes. They also discovered the river wasn't really a river. It was more like a chain of violent rapids and waterfalls that just smashed their canoes to pieces, forcing them to spend days hacking trails through the jungle. Then there were the insects. Swarms of biting flies, wasps whose stings could knock a man out with a fever for a full day. And always, always lurking just out of sight were the Nyambiquara warriors, a silent, constant threat that just frayed everyone's nerves.
And things just fell apart with shocking speed. Within a couple of weeks, the rapids claimed 2 of their biggest canoes, taking a huge chunk of their food with them. Then, real tragedy struck. A canoe got sucked into a whirlpool. A paddler named Simplicio, gone, drowned. Just days later, the stress, the exhaustion, the starvation, it all boiled over. A paddler named Julio was caught stealing food, and he murdered Sergeant Pachion in cold blood, then just vanished into the jungle. Death wasn't just coming from the river anymore, it was coming from inside their own ranks.
Roosevelt actually wrote about the fate of that murderer, Holyoke. He imagined the guy running into the jungle, not to escape, but just to enter a different kind of prison. He knew the wilderness itself would be the judge, jury, and executioner. He wrote that the man was now in a living hell, stalked by the same fever and famine that was haunting all of them. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The jungle doesn't just kill you, it swallows you whole.
So, in the middle of all this chaos, drownings, murder, starvation, the expedition's greatest crisis was just starting to unfold. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who seemed indestructible, he was beginning to break. His fight wasn't just against the river anymore. It was against his own body, which was waging a losing war against the jungle's invisible predators.
And it all started with a simple, clumsy accident. While they were wrestling these huge canoes through the rapids, Roosevelt slipped. His leg was gashed open on a boulder. In the filth and humidity of the Amazon, infection set in almost immediately, and it was bad. Then, to make everything worse, a dormant strain of malaria he'd probably picked up years ago in Cuba flared up with a vengeance. That 1-2 punch, it was catastrophic. His temperature rocketed to over 40 degrees Celsius, that's 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and it just stayed there for days. He fell into this violent delirium, just rambling lines of poetry over and over. The infection in his leg was so bad the expedition's doctor actually considered an emergency amputation, with nothing but a hunting knife right there in the middle of the jumble.
And this was his absolute lowest point. Roosevelt, the great leader, the man who preached about the strenuous life, now saw himself as just a liability. A deadweight. He was slowing down a starving expedition, using up precious medicine, endangering everyone's lives. And in a moment of clarity, through all that delirium, he called his son, Kermit, to his side, and he gave him a final command. Leave me. He would rather die alone than be the reason everyone else died.
But Kermit just refused. He looked at his dying father, the former president of the United States, and he just flatly refused to obey the order. He told him, "I'll either carry you out of this jungle, or I'll be buried right here beside you." What an incredible act of loyalty and defiance. A son literally refusing to let his father surrender to the abyss.
This scene just shows you how close it came. For the next few agonizing days, Roosevelt was completely helpless. The men rigged up a makeshift shelter over one of the canoes, and he just laid there, barely conscious, a ghost of the man he was, as they kept pushing downstream. He was too weak to even sit up. The former president was just living cargo on his own journey into oblivion.
Driven on by Kermit's sheer determination, and with Roosevelt somehow miraculously starting to rally, the expedition pushed on. They were this ragged group of starving, exhausted men, but now they had one single purpose: get out alive. Their escape would become one of the greatest survival stories in history, but it was a victory that came at a terrible and permanent cost.
I mean, just look at the raw numbers of this journey. They traveled nearly 1,500 kilometers down a completely unknown river. That's a journey filled with waterfalls, starvation, and disease. It took them 57 excruciating days, and it cost the lives of 3 men. One drowned, one murdered, and one, the murderer, just swallowed by the wilderness.
Finally, when they were on the absolute brink of starvation, they saw it, a sign of civilization, a small house carved out of the jungle. It was an outpost for Brazilian rubber tappers. The men who stumbled ashore were like skeletons. Their clothes were rags, their bodies were scarred and gaunt, but they were alive. They had actually conquered the river of doubt.
So when you tally it all up, what was the final score? Well, the cost was immense. Health that was shattered for life. 3 men dead. Months of pure agony. But the reward was historic. They put a 1,500-kilometer river on the map of the world, a river that the Brazilian government immediately renamed the Rio Roosevelt in his honor. They did what they set out to do, and they created an immortal legend of survival in the process.
But for Theodore Roosevelt, that journey never really ended. He lost over 25 kilos, that's more than 55 pounds, and came home a shadow of the man who left. Those malarial fevers came back, again and again. Complications from that leg infection tormented him until he died, just 5 years later in 1919. He survived the Amazon, but a part of him never truly escaped it.
And that really leaves us with this final thought. Roosevelt's journey down the river of doubt is this incredible story of discovery and human endurance. But it's also a pretty brutal reminder of the cost of ambition when it comes face to face with the raw power of nature. It really makes you wonder, what is the true price we're willing to pay just to see what lies beyond the edge of the map?